Can I
were
start?
distributed across communities, particularly between marginalized and non-marginalized communities in South Africa. And because these communities tend to be quite concentrated in space, how it affected as well local income. So the motivation is that there is a growing literature that reveals that the levels of economic development we observe today can be traced back to specific historical episodes, and we can go back a long amount of time, and we can still find relationships between what happened many years ago and the levels of development we observe today. And this can be observed both in country level analysis. So there is a lot of evidence suggesting that at the country level, income per capita today is driven by things that happened a long time ago and that affect the institutions. There is also more recently evidence that within countries, development of different regions can be traced back to things that historical institutions that affected those particular regions. So there's a nice paper by Melissa Dell looking at the long-term impacts of forced mining labor system in Peru and how it affects local economic development today of regions that are very close to each other, but some were imposed to that system and others were not. Nunn summarizes this literature saying that the persistence of historical shocks typically arises, has been typically found to arise through either persistence in domestic institutions or cultural traits. But he also notes that there is still comparatively little evidence helping us to understand when given historical shock persists and when it does not, and if not, why. And this is typically because we look at data today and we try to trace back what happened a long time ago, so we don't have a lot of evidence on mechanisms on the things that happen in between. So this paper, we're going to try to add a bit to that discussion, and we're going to try to identify some new channels by which a bad historical legacy, the apartheid, was turning for some communities to a less bad one, but still a very bad one. So the setting is post-apartheid South Africa from 1996 to 2011. These shaded areas here in the map are the areas that were destined to the marginalized communities, so the black, in particular the black communities or non-white communities. I'm going to tell you a lot more about them. And we're going to show that even though these areas no longer exist, there are still huge gaps of income of communities just between and just outside. And the path of income that they observed after the dismantling of apartheid was influenced by a change in labor law that affected how rents were distributed. So essentially we're going to provide strong evidence that, and we're going to document these persistent large income gaps between communities that were just inside and just outside these areas. And we are going to argue that the fact that after apartheid ended created a more balanced power between the unions in the mining sector and the firms, helped communities that were previously not getting a fair share of the rents to increase their income more fastly than the other communities. We're going to provide some additional evidence that this channel remains important even when we account for many other channels that affected the development of these communities. So we're going to account for changes in access to infrastructure, changes in access to market access and connectivity of these communities, and also we're going to try to account with the data that we have for internal migration affecting also income. So just to give you some historical context, so the apartheid was in place between 48 and 94, and it was a system of racial segregation that started before actually, started in the colonial times with Dutch and British rule, but was reinforced during this period. Residents were classified according to racial groups, and there was a systematic, introduced by law, segregation of residential areas and also a segregation of public goods, including education. So essentially, these non-white communities were regarded as a source of cheap labor, and they were prepared, they had an education system to prepare them to work as such. An important institution of the apartheid was this homeland system. So the government sought to actually divide South Africa into separate nation states, and through 3 pieces of legislation started to create conditions for these areas to become autonomous and independent nation states. So these areas are here represented in the shaded map, the shaded areas in the map. And they accounted for just 13% of the land, but for more than 50% of the population. And some people already live there, were natives of these areas, but many other people were forced to move into these areas. Millions of people were forced to move into these areas. This intention of the ruling government at the time to make them independent states was actually fulfilled for some of them, not to all of them, because then apartheid started to be reversed. They were never recognized as such by the international community, but they were considered independent states. So during this period of apartheid, and even before, these privileged racial groups were really suffering, or there was a number of pieces of labor legislation that really affected their access to jobs and their ability to negotiate for their wages. And also the ability to work in specific occupations. They were also limited on their ability to run business, to move from these areas. They need a migration pass to move. And in the beginning, they couldn't unionize, they couldn't bargain for their wages, and this started to be reversed later on. And unions actually played a very important role in the end of apartheid, so they were part of the political system as well that led to the end of apartheid. So with the end of apartheid, South Africa did no longer have its own land, so it completely redesigned the administrative system and also put in place a constitution that compares well with most constitutions in developed countries, and also put in place a number of labor laws that compare well with the labor codes of most developed countries, so without discrimination, the ability to form a union, the right to unionize, etc., etc. So we argue that this change in regime constitutes a shock to labor relations and for the ability of these communities to bargain for a share of the rents that are created in the mining sector. The mining sector, we are going to argue, we're going to focus a lot on that mechanism, so I'm going to describe a bit its role in the economy. So, as I mentioned, it had an important role both in the rise and fall of the apartheid, because a lot of these coercive institutions were directed actually to workers that worked in the resource extraction. It has three main commodities: gold, platinum, and diamonds. South Africa is a lead producer and also has some of the largest reserves. This industry accounted for about 46% of exports, so a lot of export revenue comes still in 2011 from commodity exports, and it's really most of it most of production is directed towards exports. And it's a highly concentrated industry, so the bulk of production is controlled by 5 private mining investment houses. It benefits also from a favorable evolution of international prices from the end of apartheid. So there was already an industry fairly highly concentrated, so there were already rents being created, and also there was experienced a positive shock during this period. And it's the industry with the highest degrees of unionization in the country, so a bargaining model is quite relevant to describe what's going on. So just to motivate the analysis, I'm going to present a simple theory, or the mechanism that we're going to exploit empirically, just a simple theory of trade in natural resources, coercion, and rent sharing. There's nothing too new about the model, but I think it's useful just to frame the analysis. So there is a single industry. We're going to examine this in partial equilibrium. And then there is imperfect market competition that generates these profits. And unionized workers can capture a share of it in the form of higher wages. And we're going to use this simple model to examine how, if you dismantle coercive institutions, affect the distribution of these rents, and also how, if there is an international price, how that interacts with coercive institutions to drive up or down wages. So there are N domestic producers and star foreign producers producing an homogeneous commodity to a global integrated market, which I think is a fairly realistic description of this market. Firms compete in quantities, which is also appropriate for this industry. And global demand is going to be represented by a simple linear function, but the results really don't depend on the functional form. Labor, for simplicity, is the only variable factor of production, but firms must incur a fixed cost to produce in this sector. And the marginal product of labor is constant and normalized to 1. Because we're going to focus on the distribution of rents in South Africa, we're going to assume that the domestic producers are going to be unionized through an industry-level labor union. The foreign wages are exogenous. It doesn't really matter if you assume that foreign foreign firms are also unionized. Unions care both about wages and employment, and they will bargain over wages first, and then firms unilaterally, once the wage is set, will set their employment and output levels. This is solved by backward induction. So this is a typical solving for production unit economic model. So we have profits, then we get the reaction functions, how the outputs of domestic and foreign firms are related, and then we get equilibrium outputs for a given wage. And with these expressions, we can then compute the bargaining wages. It's going to simply be a weighted average of union utility and these profits, and the beta here, which weights the two different parts, is going to be the relative bargaining power of the union. So the equilibrium wage is going to depend. The union cares both about wages and employment, so it's the difference between the outside option of the worker and the wage it gets, and also it cares about employment, so it internalizes the fact that if you increase wages, employment is going to fall. So why their output is going to depend on wages, so if you ask for a higher wage, your employer is going to lower the amount of employment. So when you bargain in the first stage, you anticipate, the union anticipates the fact that the higher wage will have unemployment, but still you have that, if you have a more powerful union, it's going to capture a higher share of profits, and then you get higher wages. So we see that the dismantling of coercive institutions in this setting will affect wages via two channels. On one hand, it will increase the bargaining power of the union directly via changes in the labor code, but it also affects the outside option of workers by allowing them now to move outside these areas and work in many other occupations, etc. So both channels would allow workers to get a higher share of rent. And also importantly, because the industry observed positive international price shocks, in part because China started demanding more commodities during this period, and so prices have gone up. If this rises rents, but how these rents are distributed crucially depends on the bargaining power of the union. So if there were no changes in beta because of these changes in labor laws, you would expect these rents to go mainly to the communities that had initially more bargaining power, so to mine owners and to workers, white workers that were outside these areas and that were in the beginning having a lot of more bargaining power. So it's not just the level of rents, but also the increase in rents that you observe because of higher prices would be distributed differently if there weren't these changes in labor law. So we take this to the data, this mechanism to the data using two types of data. Both have advantages and disadvantages. We use community level data from the 1996 and 2011 census. The advantage of this data is that it's very detailed geographically, and it's going to allow us to also explore and control for other potential impacts that these communities suffer that are not associated with this mechanism. And because black labor is really concentrated in space, anything that would affect their incomes would not be captured easily with individual level data, because individual level data lack geographical identifiers. However, we also use individual level data because it allows us to provide more direct evidence on the mechanism that is consistent with the evidence that we're going to provide at the community level. So we think that both sets of data are useful for the analysis, and they complement each other. A limitation is that the data doesn't go back to the pre-apartheid, the end of apartheid period, so it only covers the post-apartheid period. For obvious reasons, the government didn't want to collect a lot of data in these areas where most black people lived before the end of apartheid. So that's a limitation, and that's going to affect a bit our ability to control for pre-trans and so on. I better say this in advance. So I think we see as an important contribution of the paper just the descriptive part, just documenting the gaps and see the evolution of persistence. And we are struck, so just let me say what we'll do. We'll compare areas that are just outside these shaded areas with those that are just inside. And we'll pull the data, and we can then make these RD type graphs, although they are just descriptive. I'm not going to make very strong arguments about causality here, but they are a useful descriptive tool. And you see that both in 96 and 2011, these areas on the left that are the areas inside the homeland are still essentially black areas, so the share of black population is 100%. And outside you have more mixed, and it slightly increased the share of black population outside, but not that much. When you look also at the evolution of income per capita, you see that the gaps are enormous, both in 96, which is the end of apartheid, and also in 2001. And so you see this clear evidence of persistence. Even though these areas don't exist anymore, just the fact that you live in an area that was previously affected by this regime, as I mentioned, the way it was, still in 2011, the income gaps are huge. However, even though the absolute income gap increased, the relative income gap decreased. So you have, in relative terms, you have a higher growth of these communities inside the homelands after the period. So there is high persistence in these disparities, but there was convergence of income in the post-apartheid period. So essentially what we'll try to do is argue that these heterogeneous levels of convergence were affected by the degree of exposure of these communities to mining rents. So communities that were more exposed initially to these rents would benefit more for the stronger ability to bargain for them, and so they would experience a faster rate of growth in the post-apartheid period. The communities that were outside, some of them, because there are also black workers living outside, will also have experienced a shock, but it will be to a much less degree because they would have both types of workers there, and the results would be a lot attenuated. And so, graphically, I'm going to show you later, sorry. So just to provide some evidence on the initial conditions at the individual level. So you see that using census data for 96, you see that indeed there is evidence of, even when you account for education and occupation and so on, there is evidence of a very negative wage premium for black workers. There is evidence of a premium of the mining industry consistent with this sharing of rents, but there is also evidence that this premium against black workers was stronger in the mining industry than in other industries. So when we work at the community level, the main identification strategy will be, so we will try to explain this change in growth of the community by the fact that it was inside or outside the homeland, and whether it had a higher or smaller exposure to these resource rents. So we interact being inside the homeland with the share of employment in mining of that community in the initial period. And we account for province fixed effects, municipality fixed effects, a number of initial characteristics, because we know that these communities were not exactly the same, they were very different. And we'll include as well a number of attributes that we see changing over time to account for other changes other than this channel that we'll try to identify. So just to show you that mining was not concentrated inside or outside, so there was mining employment both inside these homelands and outside, which is good for our purposes. And visually, the main result of the paper at the community level is that here the red dots are those communities that had a share larger than 90% of employment in the mining sector. You see that, the black ones are those that have a share higher than 90%. You see that communities inside the homelands that had a high proportion of employment in mining saw much larger rates of growth than communities that had relatively low shares of employment in mining. And communities outside the homelands that have a more mixed composition of demographical groups, you don't observe any clear association between the share of employment in mining and the trajectory of income growth. So essentially this is the main pattern that will capture in the regressions at the community level, and that will show we're going to be robust to a number of specifications. So this is the main baseline specification. You see that the interaction between being inside the homeland and the initial share of employment in mining is a strong positive predictor of growth of this community, even when you include initial controls and also when you account for other changes in other attributes of these communities over time. When you include also municipality fixed effects, we are comparing communities just inside and just outside municipalities. you see that the results are quite stable across these specifications. In the main analysis, we are using a 30-kilometer bandwidth for dividing communities just inside and outside, but this really doesn't matter. You can shrink that interval, and you can also employ the same specification across all South Africa. We do restrict the analysis so that we have more comparable communities in a geographical sense, but when you expand the data set to include all South Africa, you see the same pattern. And also when you look just inside communities in the homelands, you see that those that were initially more exposed to these rents performed better in the post-apartheid period in terms of income per capita growth than the others. Initially, we controlled just for distance to the homeland with a linear specification, but the results are quite robust as well to controlling, to using a lot of other functional forms so that they capture potentially more heterogeneity of these locations. Yeah.
You told us a lot about dismantling institution, but what about exports of mining output, right?
Yeah.
During apartheid, there were sanctions, there was pressure. So I assume that after apartheid was gone, right, mining expanded, and perhaps these are not attractive jobs, so they are going to be primarily taken up by black people. I'm just trying to understand how that squares with your story.
Yeah, so I think both the prices and the level of output change in the post-apartheid period. So theoretically we saw that relationship between the amount of rents and the bargaining power. So even if you have an increase in the amount of rents, the bargaining power really matters for how these marginal rents are distributed across workers. So it still is according to our story. Unfortunately, we cannot really track employment in the sector because the census of 2011 didn't cover the industry breakdown. But we have some individual data on the trajectories of individual wages. So I think it's a relevant point about changes in the sector. As unfortunately, we cannot do much more than track the relative performance of wages in this sector and control for individual attributes and so on. But we don't have much more ability to observe what happened inside the sector in this economy. So this community level analysis, I think, is useful because it's going to allow us also to control for other factors that affected the development of the community. But the mechanism occurs essentially at the worker level, although there is a union bargaining on behalf of workers, but it acts affecting workers' wages. So we would expect, if this mechanism is relevant, you'd expect that these relative wages of black workers in the mining sector had a different trajectory from wages of black workers in other sectors, because we are arguing that this is a sector where there were rents to be shared, and this is a sector where the potential for capturing these rents is different from the others. So you do observe that we present several subsamples of this individual level data from the post-apartheid harmonized data, and we observe that there are these relative wage increases for black mining workers, and you don't observe that in other sectors. So here the base category is manufacturing, and in all other sectors you tend not to observe any differential rate of change, but for the mining industry you tend to observe these large increases in wages, in particular favoring black workers.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So, do you have any idea if in the post-apartheid there was any change on the minimum wage? I'm just thinking.
Yes, I think there were changes in a lot of other policies. We'll try to account for some of them. We believe that as long as they will not be expected to affect differentially blacks in the mining sector, our findings would not be challenged. But our ability to control accurately for all of them is not perfect. So, but there were changes in the minimum wage. As long as you do not expect them to affect differentially black workers in the mining sector, our findings would be okay. If they would affect, then if you have reasons to believe that they would be affected, then you have reasons to be concerned.
Yeah, because if people would receive less, they would probably be more likely to be affected by an increase in the minimum wage. So if you think that black people inside of the more independent areas, so in your black areas were more like had lower wages in the mining sector, they would be more likely to be to have an increase in wage. That it's like it's a legal increase and not because of bargaining power of unions. Right?
Yeah, so the mining industry as a whole paid actually in the beginning higher wages than the rest, and this industry was already unionized. I don't think that I don't think that would, especially these wage trends year by year, would not be systematically driven by that, but that may on the margin have had an effect. So we're going to try to account for these potential explanations. In particular, there is a paper by the Inclement showing that there was a significant expansion in the electricity grid in the former homelands, and this affected jobs and incomes. So if this was systematically correlated with the initial share of employment in mining, that would affect our results. Also, you might think of this as countries within countries that now gain access to the larger markets in cities, so there could be a market access story. So we also try to account for that. Again, we see that will matter, but will not take out the importance of the channel that we identify. And we may also be concerned that because people are now allowed to move, if there is selective migration and a lot of population changes, this will affect our results. Essentially, when you include controls for infrastructure items, both in '96 and 2001, they do affect they do sometimes have some influence on income, but they don't share them. They don't affect the main coefficient of interest. When we include distance to cities, you see that it affects negatively. So if cities that are more far away from cities tend to have lower income growth, and this affects in particular the homelands. But again, you see that the main coefficient of interest is not too much affected. Also, we don't observe differential population growth in these communities that have a high share of employment in mining. And we don't observe a lot of differential changes in the composition of the population in this. So there the main concern is the age group 40-59, but the total effect is not significantly different from zero. So we think that these are not major sources of concern for our baseline estimates. So just to conclude, we made, I think, 3 contributions. First, we documented these large and lasting development gaps between communities located just inside and just outside the former homeland communities. So these communities no longer exist as such from an administrative perspective, but it still matters a lot whether you were there or not before. We argue that the dismantling of course institutions and a more even distribution of natural resource exports affected how they converge towards the rest of the country. And this is also an example that when population groups are highly concentrated in space, a nationwide change in policy that affects some groups differentially can have also local economic impacts. And we see a lot of this in discussions now in the US about trade policy affecting some regions more than others because some groups are more represented there. So this is another example of that kind of situation. Thank you very much. I look forward to the conference.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me give my comments from here. Most of the comments are points where I try to understand exactly how the story works, and then there are a couple of comments on where you have an opportunity to defend that the mechanism you're proposing is the right one. I think this is a very interesting case because we tend to forget that one of the motivations probably for apartheid was the attempt to have labor and capital separated and having a part of the population basically being a provider of labor, and sometimes we are very focused on the politics, and the politics probably were driven by a lot of these incentives. But what is specific to South Africa makes the paper very interesting, but also may make it less generalizable. So I wanted to ask first, what is what is specific to your exercise in the production, in your model and the production function. So, what is the fact that you're harvesting natural resources, the fact that you have this production concentrated in certain areas, is that reflected or not in the model? In a sense, one other related point is mining is very important, but we look at the shares and they are like 5% for the homelands, maybe average, and then in some other close by regions it goes up to 15-20%. But there's a lot of stories beyond mining. How do they fit into your model? Into your model. The second issue that was touched here in an alternative way is how is the political experience of South Africa specifically contributing to your story? Because not only you have bargaining by unions, but these unions, as you pointed out, were very key for the political process. Actually, as you pointed out, the mining was very instrumental in making apartheid probably possible and desirable for a minority, but also was also part of the process of it unwinding. So the unions are not just economic mechanisms, but are political mechanisms, and that has an impact on the bargaining power of unions. Okay, so it's different. So the fact that the agenda is larger than just that. Related to this, collective bargaining, maybe you said it in the paper, but I don't remember seeing it. How prevalent is collective bargaining in this industry? How would the story work with maybe work or not without collective bargaining? And there's a very important phenomenon that you didn't refer, and that is related to this, which is the emergence of so-called, I think, wild unions, called wild unions. So there's in recent history of South Africa, there's unions that have emerged that are confronted by the established unions, which usually are very politically connected. And I wonder if these wild unions, new unions, are very different from the old unions. Different, namely, because they represent individuals that want to work, maybe with lower wages or maybe less good conditions. So there's also this very violent, as you know, confrontation between new unions and old unions. Okay. It was mentioned the role of world resource prices. I was wondering if there's any way to interpret your result that when prices go up in the world market, the more bargaining power there is assigned to the union, the more the union gets out of this. If there is some kind of possible voracity effect type of thing, where you have more resources and you ask for the demands increase much more than the resources. And one possible manifestation of that may be the so-called wild unions. Okay, so this is one. Something that, and this is the last clarification point, geography of homelands is, I wonder, or I want to guess, is not an accident. So you wanted homelands to have pools of labor, but the pools of labor need to be close to maybe cities, maybe industries, for them to be useful to the previously dominant group, right? So the location of homelands is not an accident. It doesn't seem there are basically no homelands in the East Cape and Western Cape. So I'm wondering if you can work a lot more on that. And And I think that's it. That's it for clarifications. As to the interpretation, I think you touched at least one of these points. The story of the model and most of your story is put in terms of rents. So rents is mostly distribution or redistribution, may harm total output because of the fight for redistribution, or the opposite. But the process you document is a process of economic growth. It cannot have to do with rents alone. So what is the story that brings it from the mining industry, which is important, probably for this population, it's very attractive jobs in terms of wages, etc. But what makes the story spill over from this important sector to a growth process? And one possibility that you touched on, and I had here, is education, health. You mentioned infrastructure was constrained when homelands were created, and there was some probably homogenization of access to these public goods. So what is the role played by this, and how can you assess that? One thing that I find surprising is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of migration from the homelands to the outer areas after the dismantling of the homelands. And I wondered also if there are other constraints to mobility that are not related to the legal system of apartheid. Probably also legacy of the apartheid regime, but not the legal legacy.
All right. Thanks a lot for the comments and clarification. I think this will be really useful also in revising the paper. In terms of the potential function, I think for this channel to be relevant, I think you need a relatively concentrated sector that produces rents in the sense of product market rents driven by the lack of competition, so profits essentially driven by barriers to entry. You need also some mechanism that then creates a possibility for these rents to be shared between capital and labor. This can be unions, but can also be other mechanisms that lead to industry or firm-specific wages. We have efficient, fair wage kind of models. In this case of South Africa, because unions played such an important role and the change legislation favored unions, and they are indeed quite important, so there is 71% of unionization, and also wages are driven by bargaining, then the exact composition of the union sector indeed changed, and it's complex. We make it a bit stylized in a model in the paper, but we think that's what is relevant for the story. And indeed, so if you have this setting, then any natural resource economy or even non-natural resources that has a concentrated sector that produces product market rents, and there is an exogenous change in bargaining power of labor, then this mechanism would be relevant. And it also affects how prices affect wages. It makes it a bit specific to these sectors and to countries that have these sectors. In terms of the interpretation of economic growth, indeed economic growth is vaster than just what we are saying. We are saying that this is local economic growth, and we are saying that incomes of people that are in these areas, because they tend to be highly concentrated, if they were working in the mining sector, this ability now to gain a larger share of rents would affect directly their incomes a lot. So we would see local income per capita growth as a result of that. Of course, that may then have spillovers, like how they educate their children, etc., that have even other effects on longer-term growth. But the direct channel that you are trying to capture, trying to isolate the other potential channels, is this labor mechanism. And migration is a bit of a, it happened a bit, it's a bit of a, I think people in South Africa and in the government expected that when they reformulated administrative divisions and allowed people to move, that there would be a lot more integration, actual integration. And it's a bit of a puzzle. You did see a lot of migration to shanty towns, but maybe cities were not themselves prepared to receive more people. So it's a bit of a challenge. And also, going to your point of the homelands not being exogenously placed, these are indeed placed in many cases where these native communities were. So people may feel attached to these places, and even if there are opportunities outside, they didn't feel the will to move. But thanks a lot for the discussion.
Sorry, we only have time for one question, okay? So you are lucky.
And the one story, and I do buy that story of the mining and the negotiation and the institutional setting, but I think something that when you look at the results, you're still left to think there's lots of interpretation you can give to that. So I'm wondering whether you can find a way of getting at institutional differences between the homelands or something that can give you this saying, well, and I find this particularly in the homelands where the setting is more towards institutions, to this type of bargaining, something that gets more at the bargaining to drive your story. I think this is the thing that's missing, because otherwise you can, with the mining, you can get into lots of different alternative interpretations.
Yeah.
It would be, I don't know what it would be, but something about like union density being different, or there must be something you can exploit.
Yeah, so essentially, the mechanism works mainly at the worker level and at the sector level, but then the fact that these communities are highly concentrated in place makes it more relevant from some communities than others. And we try to argue that this is a level a mechanism that works at the worker level that then has broader implications for local development because they are highly concentrated in place. But we don't argue that there are differences across homelands in the bargaining process. It's just that if you are highly exposed in a homeland to these rents, because you benefit more from the fact that now you can bargain from them. That's the main argument.